Amelie stood by the graves of her parents in Bale, the sun heavy on her back, her hands shaking as the last soil covered them. The chairs around her were almost empty. She had waited, hoping to see her husband's family arrive, the wealthy in-laws who had promised to stand by her. But no one came. Their excuse had reached her like a slap: they were too busy with wedding plans. Not even one of them spared a day to honor the lives of the people who had raised her. She swallowed her grief in silence, standing alone, staring at the rows of vacant seats that seemed to mock her pain. A few days later, when her heart was still raw, a letter arrived. She opened it expecting maybe a note of sympathy, a simple message of comfort. Instead, she found a neatly printed bill. Her husband's family had charged her $60,000 for family contributions to their son's grand wedding. Line after line of costs stared back at her: flowers worth thousands, imported wines, designer suits. And at the bottom, her name, written as if she had signed for it. The paper trembled in her hands, but her tears had already dried. The insult cut deeper than death itself. While she buried her parents alone, they dared to send her a debt, expecting her to bow her head once again. Amelie folded the paper carefully, not as a victim, but as someone who was already planning what to do next. From the very first day Amelie married Saifo, she knew she was walking into a family that would never truly accept her. They smiled in public, but their eyes told a different story. His parents whispered about her village roots, saying she was too simple for their son who had studied abroad and grew up in luxury. At family dinners, they would throw sharp little insults dressed as jokes. They called her the charity bride, as if Saifo had rescued her from poverty instead of falling in love with her. Whenever she tried to fit in, they found a way to remind her that she wasn't their kind of woman. Her clothes were too plain, her food too traditional, her laugh too loud. Nothing she did was ever enough. Amelie carried the weight of their disapproval quietly, choosing to hold on to her marriage. Saifo never openly defended her. Sometimes he stayed silent, sometimes he brushed it off with a laugh, saying his parents didn't mean harm. But Amelie knew better. Every word cut deep, and the wounds piled up slowly. Still, she endured, hoping time would soften their hearts. Then tragedy struck. Both her parents died, and she found herself grieving in Mbale with only silence around her. She had expected at least Saifo's parents to show up, to pay their respects, to stand with her during the darkest time of her life. They didn't come. Not a flower, not a card, not even a phone call. Their absence was louder than any insult they had ever spoken. But the deepest blow was yet to come. Days after the burial, a letter arrived from them. Amelie opened it with trembling hands, still clinging to a small hope that maybe it was a note of comfort, an apology, or even just a kind word. Instead, she found a bill. $60,000. Every line item spelled out like a business contract: wedding flowers, expensive suits, imported wine. And at the bottom, her name, written as though she had agreed to pay for it all. Her chest tightened as she read the words over and over. They had ignored her grief, abandoned her at her parents' graveside, and now they dared to send her a debt as if she were nothing more than their servant. It was not just about the money. It was humiliation written in black ink. It was their final stamp of rejection, their way of saying she would never belong in their world. Amelie didn't cry this time. Her tears had already been buried with her parents. Instead, she felt a fire rise inside her. She folded the bill slowly, her hands steady, her heart strangely calm. If they thought she would bow her head again, they were wrong. They had no idea the kind of woman she had become or the strength she carried within her. This was no longer just about marriage or family approval. This was about dignity. And Amelie was ready to fight for hers. Amelie sat on the edge of her bed, holding the paper that had come folded so neatly in a white envelope. It looked like a professional invoice, the kind you would expect from a company after buying something expensive. But this wasn't from a business. It was from her husband's family. Line by line, they had written down the costs of their son's grand wedding as if she were responsible for paying every cent. Venue flowers, $7,200. Designer suits, $11,000. Imported wine, $15,000. The numbers kept climbing, and with each line her stomach turned. At the bottom was her own name, scribbled in a way that made it look like she had signed for it. She hadn't signed anything. She hadn't even been asked. It wasn't just about money. It was a message. They wanted her to feel small. They wanted her to remember her place. In their eyes, she was still the girl from the village who should be grateful for any scrap of kindness, the outsider who had no voice. They believed she would do what she always did, stay quiet, accept the insult, and carry the burden without protest. That was the trap. It wasn't about $60,000. It was about breaking her spirit. But this time, they miscalculated. Amelie was no longer the same grieving girl who had buried her parents alone. Losing her family had changed something inside her. The pain had burned away her fear, leaving behind a strength she didn't even know she had. She read the invoice again, but instead of tears, a slow smile spread across her face. For the first time, she saw the arrogance of her in-laws for what it really was, weakness hiding behind money and titles. She folded the paper carefully and placed it on her desk. She thought about the empty chairs at her parents' funeral, the silence that had followed, and now this bill. They wanted to humiliate her, but they had only given her fuel. The same family that had mocked her for years had finally handed her the perfect weapon, proof of their cruelty, written down in their own words. Amelie sat back and let the fire inside her grow. They expected her to bow her head again, to carry this weight quietly. But she was done being quiet. She was done carrying pain that did not belong to her. The bill was not a trap for her. It was a trap for them, and soon the whole world would see it. Her in-laws thought they had handed her a debt. What they didn't know was that they had handed her a chance to stand taller than she ever had before. And this time, Amelie was ready to make them regret underestimating her. While Sipho's family was busy showing off, planning a wedding that looked more like a royal parade than a marriage, Amelie was quietly working on something they never even bothered to notice. They were too blinded by their wealth and their pride to ask how she was surviving after losing her parents. They never asked how she paid her bills, how she kept going, or how she managed to stand tall despite their cruelty. They thought she was still the poor village girl who should be grateful to be part of their rich family. But behind their backs, Amelie had been building an empire of her own. When her parents passed, she inherited their land, a stretch of fertile soil in Bale that many thought was too ordinary to matter. Amelie didn't waste a single day. She turned that land into fields of cassava and sunflowers, hiring workers from her village, giving jobs to people who had once struggled the same way she did. Slowly, season by season, she built a thriving business exporting cassava flour and sunflower oil, products that began to reach markets far beyond her country. What started small grew into something powerful, and within a few short years, Amelie was no longer the struggling bride they mocked. She was a businesswoman, a boss, a woman whose profits could crush their bill in less than a month. The $60,000 they demanded was laughable compared to what she made. She could have paid it 10 times over without blinking. But Amelie had learned something important: money wasn't the real problem. The problem was respect. The problem was the way they tried to humiliate her at every turn, as if she were less than them. Paying the bill would have meant accepting their insult. It would have meant bowing her head again, letting them win. And Amelie was finished with that. So she came up with a plan, not just to refuse them, but to show them who she truly was. She knew her in-laws cared more about image than anything else. They loved to be admired, to be seen as untouchable. What better way to strike them than in the one place they thought they were safe, in public, at their golden wedding where all eyes would be on them? Amelie decided she would not fight them in silence. She would fight them on the biggest stage they had built for themselves. She looked at the bill one last time and laughed softly to herself. To them, it was a weapon to crush her spirit. To her, It was the perfect tool to flip the story. She folded it neatly and tucked it away, her mind already rehearsing every word she would say when the time was right. Her in-laws thought they knew everything about her, but there was one thing they didn't know: Emily was no longer their victim. She was their reckoning. The wedding day finally came, and the city buzzed with talk about it. Sipho's parents had spared no expense. The venue looked like something out of a movie, with crystal chandeliers, golden table settings, and flowers flown in from across the world. Guests arrived in glittering gowns and tailored suits, cameras flashing as luxury cars lined up outside. To everyone watching, it was the grandest event of the year, a display of power and wealth that his family wanted the whole world to see. They were proud, smiling, already basking in the praise of their friends. But they had no idea that beneath all the lights and music, a storm was quietly walking through their doors. Emily RSVP'd like everyone else, her acceptance sent with the politest smile. She did not wear diamonds, nor did she come in designer fabric. She chose the same simple black dress she had worn to her parents' burial. To others, it looked plain, even strange in a room full of gold and glitter. To her in-laws, it was another reminder of why they thought she didn't belong. They believed her dress was a symbol of weakness, proof that she was out of place among them. What they didn't know was that it wasn't weakness at all, it was her armor. Every step she took in that dress was a reminder of her pain, her strength, and the fire they had unknowingly lit inside her. In her hand, she carried a small sleek envelope. It looked ordinary, nothing compared to the sparkling invitations and expensive gifts piled up at the wedding. But inside that envelope was the one thing that could bring the entire golden celebration crashing down. It wasn't money, it wasn't jewelry, it was the very same bill her in-laws had sent her, now turned into her weapon. She had waited patiently for this moment, and she knew exactly what she would do when the time came. She sat quietly at her table, watching as the night unfolded. The band played soft music, guests clapped and cheered, the bride and groom danced their first dance. Laughter filled the room, and Sipho's parents moved proudly among their guests, shaking hands, receiving praise for the wedding's grandeur. They looked untouchable in their world of power and wealth. But Emily was calm, almost too calm. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. She had carried too much pain to be afraid of people like them. Every smile they flashed, every boast they made, only made her more certain that this night would not end the way they imagined. She gently tapped the envelope against her lap, her eyes steady on the stage. The moment was coming, and she would be ready. To everyone else, she was just another guest in a plain black dress. To Sipho's family, she was still the outsider who never truly belonged. But soon, they would realize that the woman they had dismissed so easily was about to turn their celebration into ashes before dessert was even served. The music slowed, and the groom's parents walked proudly to the stage, glasses raised high. The room went quiet as they began their toast. Their words were dripping with pride and arrogance. They thanked the guests for coming, bragged about the money they had spent, and then, with sly smiles, they made a little joke about Emily. They spoke of family obligations, and how some people forget what they owe when they marry into greatness. Laughter rolled across the hall, but it was sharp, directed at her like a knife. Emily sat still, her face calm, her fingers brushing against the envelope in her lap. When they finished, she stood up. The movement alone was enough to make the room pause. She walked slowly to the stage, her black dress trailing behind her like a shadow among the gold. She took the microphone, her voice steady, almost too steady for the moment. "Since we are speaking of family obligations," she said softly, "I think it is time I address mine." A murmur spread through the hall. She pulled the envelope from her hand and unfolded the paper inside. It was the very bill they had sent her. She began to read it aloud, line by line, her voice slicing through the silence. Venue flowers, $7,200. Designer suits, $11,000. Imported wine, $15,000. Each number hung in the air like a hammer striking the floor. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some gasped. Others whispered. Everyone could see it clearly now, the arrogance written down in black and white. Amelie looked up at her in-laws, their smiles stiff, their eyes narrowing with panic. Then she did the unthinkable. She flipped the paper over, revealing bold words she had written at the top: reimbursement invoice, payable by Groom's family. The room fell completely silent. She explained, her tone calm but sharp, how she had buried her parents alone while these very people skipped their duty to plan a party. She told them how they had dared to send her a bill while her heart was still broken, treating her as if she were less than human. Her words cut deeper than the numbers. "This," she said firmly, holding up the paper for everyone to see, "is not my debt. This is yours." Then she slid the bill across the table toward the groom, her hand steady, her eyes unflinching. The sound of the paper landing on the polished surface echoed through the hall louder than any music could have. Every smug smile froze. The guests stared in disbelief. The groom's parents' faces drained of color, their pride crumbling in front of the very crowd they wanted to impress. Even Saipho, standing beside his new bride, could only stare at Amelie with his jaw tight, realizing too late the storm he had married into. In that moment, the celebration cracked wide open, and silence swallowed the hall whole. Amelie stood tall on the stage, the entire hall frozen as her words cut through the heavy silence. She did not rush. She took her time, her voice calm but strong, each word carrying the weight of years of pain. She held up the invoice again and explained exactly what it meant. She reminded everyone how she had buried her parents alone, standing in front of rows of empty chairs that his family had promised to fill. She spoke of the humiliation she felt when, instead of comfort, they had sent her a bill as if her grief was nothing compared to their party. She described the cruel irony of watching her parents lowered into the ground while her in-laws busied themselves with flowers, wine, and designer suits. The hall was so quiet that even the soft clink of glasses stopped. Guests leaned forward, their eyes wide, shocked by what they were hearing. Amelie did not shout. She did not cry. She spoke with a steady tone that cut sharper than anger ever could. "You billed me while I buried the only family I had," she said, her eyes fixed on the groom's parents. "You thought I would bow my head. You thought I would pay for your pride. Tonight, I return the debt where it belongs." With that, she lowered the paper and walked down from the stage. Each step echoed against the floor, heavy and deliberate. She approached the table where the groom and his family sat, their faces pale, their hands frozen mid-gesture. Then, with a quiet finality, she placed the invoice in front of Saipho. The sound of the paper sliding across the polished wood was louder than the music, louder than the whispers that now rippled through the room. "This is your bill," she said simply, her eyes never leaving his. It was not shouted, it was not dramatic. But it landed like thunder. Saipho's parents shifted uncomfortably, their pride collapsing under the weight of the truth now hanging in the air. The guests were stunned, some covering their mouths, others whispering to each other. Phones were already being lifted, recording every second, every word. The perfect wedding they had spent $500,000 on had just turned into a public reckoning. Even Saipho himself sat frozen. His jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on Amelie as if he was only now seeing her for the first time. She was no longer the quiet bride he thought would endure anything. She was fire, she was strength, and she was not afraid of him or anyone tied to his name. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence swallowed the hall, heavy and suffocating. All the lights, the music, the glittering wealth meant nothing anymore. All that remained was a single piece of paper on the table, and a woman who refused to be humiliated one more time. That was the drop that broke them. In that instant, the wedding was no longer theirs. It was hers. Within hours of the wedding disaster, videos of Amelie's moment began flooding social media. Guests had recorded everything: the toast, her calm walk to the stage, the reading of the invoice, and finally the moment she slid it back across the table. By morning, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed across Africa, "Bride outs in-laws' cruelty at $500,000 wedding." Clips were shared millions of times, people adding captions like, "This is what strength looks like," and "Never underestimate a quiet woman." Amelie woke up to messages from strangers she had never met, sending her love, respect, and support. Women wrote to her saying they finally had the courage to stand up for themselves. Business owners reached out, offering to partner with her. Orders for her cassava flour and sunflower oil tripled overnight. What her in-laws had meant to use as humiliation turned into free publicity that lifted her higher than ever before. She had not just survived their cruelty, she had turned it into power. But for Saifo's family, the fallout was brutal. Memes mocked them, comedians turned them into jokes, and their once spotless reputation crumbled. The same society they had wanted to impress now laughed at them. Every photo of their golden wedding was reposted with captions about greed and cruelty. Amelie didn't just return their $60,000 bill. She sent back something far more expensive, the collapse of their image, the one thing they valued most. And the world made sure they paid in full.